She was just trying to keep her job. He was the reason people vanished without a trace. But when Kaya Montrell heard a man's desperate screams echoing through the Vescary estate, she couldn't stay silent, even if it cost her everything. One act of defiance. One moment of courage. And suddenly, a maid with nothing became the most dangerous woman in Lorenzo Vescary's world. This is the story of how one brave choice transformed a captive into a queen, and a ruthless mafia boss into a man willing to burn his empire to the ground. Before we dive deeper into the world of the Vescary Mafia, take a second to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. You will not want to miss how a single act of defiance changes everything in this story. Trust me, the ending of this empire-building saga is worth the price of admission. The screaming started at midnight. Kaya Montrell froze, her cleaning cart abandoned in the hallway outside the Vescary estate's private study. She knew better than to listen. Knew better than to care. For 3 years, she'd perfected the art of being invisible, headphones in, eyes down, ears closed to the sounds that echoed through these marble corridors. But this wasn't the kind of screaming that came from typical business disputes. This was the sound of someone being unmade. Her hands trembled as she gripped the cart's handle. The study door was cracked open just enough that she could hear the low, terrifyingly calm voice of Lorenzo Vescary himself. Renzo. Even his name moved through the estate like a predator's shadow. Where is the DeLuca shipment? Another scream. Wet. Broken. Kaya's stomach twisted. She should leave. Should walk away. Should be anywhere but here, bearing witness to something that would get her killed just for knowing it. Instead, her feet carried her toward the door. Through the gap, she could see a man, bloodied, suspended between 2 guards, his face a map of fear and agony. His terrified eyes lifted, searching the hallway. When they found her, something shifted. A silent plea. A desperate, wordless prayer. Help me. She saw the calculation in those eyes. This man knew he was going to die. He just needed someone to know he wasn't the monster they believed him to be. Kaya's hand raised. She knocked on the study door before her survival instinct could stop her. Everything went silent. The screaming stopped. The guards froze. And Lorenzo Vescary, Renzo, turned his head slowly, as if moving through water, his cold gray eyes locking onto hers with the precision of a sniper's scope. For a moment, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was the most visible woman in the world. And that was going to destroy her. The study door swung inward at Kaya's knock, and the air froze solid. 3 guards stood rigid, their massive frames casting shadows that seemed to swallow the room whole. The man suspended between them was barely conscious, his face a canvas of blood and resignation. And then there was Renzo. He stood with his back to the door, perfectly tailored charcoal suit pristine despite the chaos, hands clasped behind his back like he was admiring fine art rather than destroying a human being. When he turned, his gray eyes moved across her with the precision of a blade. Out, he said quietly. The guards didn't hesitate. They hauled the bloodied man toward a side exit, his feet dragging, leaving smears across marble that no amount of cleaning would ever erase. Kaya's throat was dust. She should have run when they passed her, should have melted back into the hallway and pretended she'd never heard anything. 3 years at the Vescary estate had taught her the most important rule: invisibility kept you alive. But she'd heard them that morning. 2 guards joking in the kitchen while she arranged flowers, their words carelessly brutal. The boss wants someone to blame for the DeLuca shipment. Doesn't matter who. Vinny's convenient. They'd laughed like it was nothing. Like they weren't condemning a man to death for a crime he didn't commit. Why are you still here? Renzo asked, not moving, just watching her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve by breaking. Her mouth moved before her survival instinct could stop it. He's innocent. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes. Renzo's head tilted slightly, as if he'd misheard her, as if the maid who cleaned his bathrooms and arranged his study just spoke directly to him about an interrogation she had no business witnessing. The real leak, Kaya continued, her voice steadier than her hands, is somewhere else. I heard the guards this morning. They're setting him up. She watched his expression shift, not to anger, which would have been merciful. Instead, something darker bloomed behind his eyes. Interest. The kind of attention that preceded ruin. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Kaya." "Well, Kaya." He moved toward her with the grace of something predatory. "You've just made yourself very interesting. And in my world, interesting is infinitely more dangerous than invisible." He paused at the doorway, his shadow falling across her. "Everyone out. Everyone except her. Leave us." The guards exchanged glances but obeyed without question. The door clicked shut, sealing them into a space that suddenly felt impossibly small. Renzo smiled. It was the most frightening thing she'd seen all night. He didn't kill her that night. Instead, he questioned her. Hours bled into one another in the study, the leather chair behind his desk suddenly feeling like an interrogation room of a different kind. Renzo moved through her life like an archaeologist, careful and deliberate, examining each piece of who she was. Where she came from, a single mother in Newark who'd taught her that silence was complicity. Why she'd risked everything for a stranger, because she'd learned that good people stayed silent, and silence was how evil won. What she'd observed in 3 years at the estate, everything. Names, habits, which guards took bribes, which ones were loyal, the schedule of his operations, the rhythm of his world. He listened with the intensity of someone genuinely fascinated. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You're extraordinary," he said simply. Most people would have walked away. Most people would have let him die. "Most people aren't trying to be invisible," she replied, surprising herself with the answer. "No," he agreed. "But you weren't trying to be invisible tonight, were you? You were trying to save a man's life. You risked yours to do it." He stood, moving to the window where the estate lights cast everything in amber. "That kind of courage is rare. That kind of conscience is dangerous. And that kind of person." He turned back to face her, "Cannot exist as a loose end in my organization." 3 days passed in a blur. Kaya returned to her duties at the estate, but something had shifted. Guards watched her differently. Renzo's attention had made her visible in ways that terrified her. Then came the night when she was dragged from her small staff quarters by armed men, her protests ignored, her pleas unheard. The official story spread through the estate like wildfire. Kaya Montrell had been taken by Renzo's enemies as leverage. The truth was infinitely more complicated. The penthouse occupied the top floor of a downtown tower, all floor-to-ceiling windows and cold marble, a space that screamed wealth and power. Guards occupied every entrance. She could see the city stretching below her, and it felt impossibly far away. Renzo arrived as evening collapsed into darkness, still wearing his suit like armor. He moved through the space with ownership, then faced her across a distance that felt infinite. "You saved a life," he said, echoing his words from 3 nights prior. "Now I'll save yours, by keeping you close where I can control the variables." Kaya understood then. This wasn't protection. This was possession. The act of mercy that had defined her had become her cage. The penthouse was gilded and luxurious, but it was still a prison. And the man before her wasn't her savior. He was her captor. And she'd handed him the key herself. The penthouse became her kingdom and her cell in equal measure. Kaya fell back into the rhythms of domesticity, dusting, cooking, arranging flowers in crystal vases that probably cost more than her mother's house, but everything had changed. She was still invisible, but now it was by design. Renzo needed her unseen, needed her present, needed her to move through his world like a ghost while he built an empire around her. It took 3 nights to understand the true nature of her confinement. The penthouse walls were thin in certain places, and Renzo's office was adjacent to the kitchen. She heard him at 2 a.m., his voice like broken glass through the phone, demanding information about shipments and territory. She heard the paranoia creeping into his tone, a tremor that didn't belong in a man of his caliber. By the first week, she noticed the insomnia. He moved through the penthouse at night like a ghost hunting ghosts, and she'd catch him watching her work during the day. His eyes tracked her movements with an intensity that should have frightened her more than it did. He was studying her. Learning her. The same way she was learning him. The documents appeared on his desk one evening, security reports scattered across mahogany, photographs of shipments, names she recognized from estate conversations. The DeLuca organization was making moves. Territory shifts. Aggressive positioning. Someone was feeding them information. Someone was bleeding Renzo's operation dry from the inside. She photographed everything with the burner phone she'd found in her assigned bedroom, the only thing left for her, a breadcrumb trail suggesting Renzo anticipated her resourcefulness. The reports were dated. The shipment losses corresponded to specific people. A pattern emerged like a bloodstain spreading across silk. Then she found the security footage. Buried in Renzo's private files, archived and timestamped, was video of Lieutenant Dominic Castellano meeting with a man she didn't recognize in the parking garage 3 levels below the penthouse. Money changed hands. Information was exchanged. The lieutenant looked over his shoulder, paranoid but committed to his betrayal. Castellano had been with Renzo for 15 years. He sat at his right hand during meetings. He knew everything. Kaya held the knowledge like a blade. Information was currency in Renzo's world, and she'd just become enormously wealthy. She could trade it. Leverage it. Use it to secure her freedom or her life, or perhaps something she hadn't even considered yet. But as she moved through the penthouse that night, arranging his dinner, pouring his whiskey, watching him pace with the weight of invisible betrayal crushing him, she realized something shifted in her calculations. Information wasn't just power. Information was survival. And in this golden cage, she'd just become indispensable. It started with whiskey and insomnia. Renzo began appearing in the penthouse kitchen after midnight, when the city below turned into a glittering graveyard and silence became its own kind of weapon. He'd find her there, sometimes she was still awake, sometimes he'd wake her, and he'd pour 2 glasses without asking if she wanted one. They'd sit at the marble counter, and he'd talk. Not demands. Not threats. Just words, bleeding out of him like he'd been holding them in for decades. He told her about his rise through the ranks, how he'd learned that mercy was a luxury only the dead could afford. How he'd built an empire by being the man people feared more than death itself. How every decision he'd made, every line he'd crossed, every person he'd erased was necessary. Essential. The price of power. But his voice changed when he talked about the cost. No one trusts you when they're afraid of you, he said one night, swirling amber liquid in crystal. They obey. They bow. But they never trust you. Not really. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected, exhaustion. Not of the body, but of the soul. Do you know what that's like? To command absolute loyalty and receive none? Kaya listened the way she'd been trained to listen, fully present, completely silent. But something was shifting inside her, something dangerous and unwelcome. She was beginning to see the fractures in his armor. The places where the monster wore thin. He told her about his childhood, about a father who'd taught him that weakness was death. About watching men betray him, about learning that everyone had a price. About building walls so high that nothing could touch him. Except she had. 6 months, he said quietly, and the confession hung between them like a blade. I watched you at the estate for 6 months. You were kind to the staff. Actually kind. You saw them. Not as servants. As people. He set down his glass with deliberate care. You're the only person who's ever looked at me and didn't see something to fear. You saw. He paused, struggling with the vulnerability. You saw someone worth defending. Take a moment. This part of the story, where a monster reveals his human side, is what makes it resonate. If this story has hooked you, smash the like button as a show of support. Let me know in the comments if you think Renzo can actually be redeemed, or if he's destined to fall. Let's get back to the final act. The truth crystallized then, sharp and terrifying. The kidnapping wasn't punishment. It was collection. He'd taken her not because he wanted to control her, but because he needed to keep her close. Because in a world built on betrayal and violence, she was the only thing that felt real. Kaya's guard, so carefully maintained, began to crumble. Not from fear anymore, but from something far more dangerous, understanding. Renzo's empire was collapsing from within, rotting from betrayal, and she might be the only person he had left to trust. The only person he could trust. The problem was, she was beginning to understand why. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a courier who knew better than to ask questions. Renzo was on the terrace when his security team brought it to him, and Kaya watched his entire body go rigid the moment he opened it. She knew something was catastrophically wrong before she saw his face. The photograph fell to the marble floor like a verdict. Renzo's hand on her back, her body leaning into his, both of them leaving the penthouse together. It was a moment she didn't even remember, so routine, so ordinary, until she saw the red target drawn across her face with the precision of a professional. Beneath it, a single line of text: "If you stand up, we both die." The color drained from Renzo's face. Not fear, he was incapable of fear in the conventional sense, but rage. A kind of rage that preceded violence. He moved through the penthouse like a hurricane contained in a suit, barking orders into his phone, calling for cars and safe houses and protocols that made it clear, the DeLucas knew. They'd been watching. They understood exactly how to dismantle him. "We're moving you," he said, not asked. His hands were already on her shoulders, his touch urgent and possessive. "Tonight. You'll go to the compound upstate. Then maybe Miami. Somewhere they can't touch you." "No." The word left her mouth before calculation could stop it. Renzo's eyes snapped to hers, and for a moment she thought he might actually kill her out of sheer frustration. "This isn't negotiable, Kaya. You can't protect me by moving me around like a chess piece," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "Every time you relocate me, you expose the network. Every safe house becomes a target. Every guard becomes a liability." She took a breath. "We need to find the traitor." "I know who the traitor is," she continued, the words tumbling out before she lost her nerve. "Lieutenant Castellano. He's been meeting with DeLuca representatives for weeks. I have footage. Documents. I found everything on your desk, and I've been tracking his movements." She pulled out the burner phone, hands shaking slightly as she navigated to the files. "He's the one bleeding your operation. He's the reason they know about me." Renzo stared at the footage playing across the small screen, Castellano in the parking garage, the exchange, the betrayal crystallized in pixels. His expression shifted through fury, shock, and something that might have been relief. "You've been investigating," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I've been surviving," she corrected. "And so have you, apparently. Your traitor just gave us an advantage." But as Renzo took the phone from her hands, as his guards began moving with new purpose through the penthouse, she realized something far more dangerous. Castellano knew she'd uncovered him. And a cornered rat, she understood, was infinitely more lethal than a confident one. The target on her face had just become active. The plan took shape across Renzo's desk like a war map, which it essentially was. Satellite images of the penthouse, security protocols, guard rotations, every weakness and advantage mapped out in meticulous detail. Kaya traced her finger along the corridors, the service hallway that connected to Renzo's office, the security blind spot between the kitchen and the study, the emergency exit that only the household staff knew about. "He'll come through here," she said, pointing to the service entrance. Castellano always comes through the service entrance when he wants to avoid the main cameras. "I've watched the pattern for weeks." Renzo stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. "You get close enough to confirm his contact. Nothing more. You don't engage. You don't." "I document everything," she finished. "I know the play, Renzo." But what she didn't say was that she was terrified. What she didn't admit was that the closer they came to executing this plan, the more real the possibility became that she might not walk away from it. They planned through the night, and something shifted between them in the darkness. This wasn't the intimacy of late-night confessions anymore. This was the intimacy of survival, of two people betting everything on each other's competence and courage. Renzo's hand found hers as they bent over the desk, his touch grounding her when everything else felt like it was dissolving into chaos. "If anything happens to you," he started, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd never allowed himself to be vulnerable enough to care if someone lived or died. "Then we both die," Kaya said quietly. "I understand the weight of that now." He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers for a moment that felt stolen from time itself. "I should never have brought you into this." "You didn't bring me in," she reminded him. "I knocked on that door. I chose this. I'm choosing it again, right now." The next evening, dressed in her household uniform, Kaya moved through the penthouse with deliberate calm. Hidden in her sleeve was a micro-camera, the kind intelligence agencies used. Renzo and his team were positioned in the security room, watching every angle, ready to intervene the moment things went wrong. Castellano arrived at 8 p.m., exactly as predicted. She saw him in the corridor, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. She heard fragments: "Tomorrow night, the warehouse, DeLuca representatives." Her hands shook as she passed him, positioning herself near enough to capture everything on the hidden camera. He didn't see her. Or maybe he did, and it no longer mattered. As she returned to the kitchen, as Renzo's voice came through her earpiece, "Got it. You're clear. Come back." Kaya understood with absolute clarity that everything was about to combust. Castellano had just confirmed the next phase of the operation. He'd just signed his own death warrant. And she just stepped across a line from which there was no return. She was no longer just Renzo's captive or his strategist. She was his weapon. Castellano moved through the penthouse like he owned it, which in a way, he did. 15 years of loyalty had earned him access that most never received. Kaya watched from the hallway as he entered Renzo's office, his movements confident, practiced, utterly devoid of conscience. She waited 3 heartbeats before following. The office was a temple of power: mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling windows, walls lined with books that Renzo had probably never read. Castellano was bent over the desk, hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as he planted a tracking device beneath the surface. Small. Sophisticated. The kind of equipment that only serious organizations possessed. The DeLucas were planning an ambush. Kaya's breath caught, but she held her position. The microcamera was already documenting everything: the device, the location, the timestamp that proved premeditation. She had what she needed. She should leave. Should retreat. Should let Renzo's security team handle this. Then Castellano turned, and their eyes locked. Recognition flashed across his face like lightning. He understood in that instant what she was. Not a maid. Not a captive. A witness. A liability. A problem that needed solving. "Kaya," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a death sentence. "This is unfortunate." He moved toward her, and instinct took over. She bolted toward the hallway, but he was faster, years of violence lending him speed. His hand grabbed her arm, spinning her around, slamming her against the wall hard enough to steal her breath. Stars exploded across her vision. "You couldn't just stay invisible," he hissed, and she saw the gun emerging from his jacket. Not threatening. Clinical. He'd done this before. But Kaya had already chosen to live. She drove her knee upward with every ounce of strength she possessed. Castellano's grip loosened just enough. She twisted, grabbed a crystal sculpture from the bookshelf, some expensive piece Renzo probably didn't even notice, and brought it down toward his face. He blocked it, but the impact sent the gun skittering across the floor. They both lunged. The gun fired. Once. Twice. The sound was apocalyptic in the enclosed space. Glass shattered, the windows, the sculptures, the careful order of the room dissolving into chaos. Kaya felt heat sear across her ribs, white-hot pain that made everything go fuzzy at the edges. She stumbled backward, her hand finding the panic button mounted beneath the desk, the one Renzo had showed her weeks ago, back when she was still just a captive learning the geography of her prison. Her fingers found it. Pressed. The alarm shrieked through the penthouse like a banshee, and suddenly the world exploded into motion. Guards poured through the door, weapons drawn, moving with the lethal efficiency of men trained for exactly this scenario. Castellano spun toward them, raising his gun, but he was already dead before he pulled the trigger. Renzo's security didn't miss. Kaya slid down the wall, her hand pressed against her side, warm blood seeping between her fingers. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Renzo's voice, frantic, raw, more terrified than she'd ever heard him. Kaya. Kaya, stay with me. Don't you dare leave me. But she was already fading into the darkness, and all she could think was, I chose this. The penthouse became a war room in seconds. Guards moved through the space like a coordinated organism, each man knowing exactly where to be, what to do, how to contain a threat that had materialized inside their supposedly impenetrable fortress. The body of Lieutenant Dominic Castellano lay sprawled across Renzo's office floor, a red stain spreading across marble like spilled wine. Medical teams arrived before the blood had finished pooling. Renzo found her exactly where she'd collapsed, her back pressed against the wall beneath the window that overlooked the glittering city. Her shirt was dark with blood, her breathing shallow and controlled, shock mixed with adrenaline creating a terrible clarity. For a moment, he just stood there, and Kaya saw something break in him. Not his composure. Something far more fundamental. He moved to her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, kneeling beside her, his hands trembling as he assessed the wound. The bullet had caught her ribs, high enough to miss vital organs but low enough that the pain was apocalyptic. I've got you, he whispered, and she'd never heard his voice sound like that, raw, stripped of all the careful control that defined him. I've got you. Don't leave me. Don't you dare leave me. His medical team moved in with practiced efficiency, applying pressure, checking vitals, preparing her for transport to the private surgical facility hidden in the building's basement. But Renzo didn't let go. His hand stayed on her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone like he was memorizing the geography of her survival. You were supposed to hide, he said, and his voice was breaking. You were supposed to let me protect you. You were supposed to, he couldn't finish, couldn't voice the possibility that she might not have survived this. Kaya's hand found his, squeezing despite the pain that made every breath feel like drowning. I was protecting you, she said, each word an effort. That's what people do when they matter to each other. Across the office, security teams recovered the tracking device, bagged it as evidence, already running calculations on what the DeLucas had intended. The ambush that was supposed to destroy Renzo had been exposed before it could crystallize. The enemy's operational plan was now his to manipulate. Castellano's betrayal had given him everything he needed. But as Kaya was lifted onto a stretcher, as Renzo walked beside her with his hand locked around hers, he understood that his empire meant nothing if she didn't survive it. Power was worthless if the only person capable of making him feel human was bleeding out in his arms. They moved through the penthouse corridors toward the surgical facility, and Renzo made calculations that shifted the entire landscape of his world. Castellano's death wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. And the DeLucas were about to learn what happened when they threatened something Lorenzo Vescari had decided to keep. They were about to learn what he was willing to burn down to protect her. He returned as the sun was setting, painting the penthouse in shades of blood and gold. Renzo moved through the private recovery room like a ghost, his expensive suit torn and stained, his face bearing the marks of a man who'd spent the last 12 hours waging war. The DeLuca retaliation had begun exactly as predicted, but Renzo had been waiting. Because of Kaya, he'd known where they would strike. Because of her sacrifice, he'd positioned his forces perfectly. Because of her courage, he was still alive. And they were winning. Kaya sat up despite the pain that lanced through her ribs, and without hesitation, she began working. She'd tended wounds before, in the kitchen of the Vescari estate, she'd learned to move efficiently, quietly, without judgment. But this was different. This wasn't professional care. This was intimacy born from desperation and choice. Her hands moved across his chest, cleaning blood that wasn't all his, carefully assessing the damage. A knife wound along his shoulder, bruising across his ribs. A graze from a bullet that had come inches from being fatal. She worked with the precision of someone who understood that survival hung on attention to detail, on the willingness to see someone clearly and care for them anyway. Renzo watched her with an expression that shifted between wonder and something far more dangerous, terror. The kind of terror that came from having something to lose. "You could leave now," he said quietly, and the words landed like stones. "In the chaos, you could disappear. No one would stop you. No one would even know." Kaya tied off the bandage on his shoulder and met his eyes. "I could. But I won't." She moved her hand to his face, her fingers gentle against the bruising. "I'm not the woman who walked into this penthouse 2 months ago. I'm not your captive anymore, Renzo. I'm staying because I choose to." He pulled her close, careful not to agitate her wound, and she felt him trembling. "This life, our life, it will never be safe. It will never be simple. Safe choices already broke my heart once," she whispered against his chest, listening to the frantic rhythm of his heartbeat. "Maybe it's time to stand with someone dangerous instead of running from them. Even if it means we both fall." There was no passion in the kiss that followed. There was only recognition. The fierce acknowledgement of two people who had looked into the abyss and chosen each other anyway. They stood at the penthouse window as darkness claimed the city, the lights below beginning to sparkle like scattered diamonds. Renzo's arm wrapped around her waist, her head resting against his chest, both of them watching the streets where his organization was consolidating power, pushing back against the DeLuca encroachment. The warning from that photograph echoed in her mind: "If you stand up, we both die." But they were already standing. Already intertwined. Already committed to facing whatever came next, not as captor and captive, not as master and servant, but as two people who had survived the impossible and chosen to burn together. The city stretched before them, glittering and merciless, and Kaya understood with absolute clarity that she'd moved from his prisoner into something far more complicated. She'd become his equal. And together, they would reshape their dangerous, unlikely world. And that is the story of how a maid became a queen, and how a monster finally found something worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe and join the community. And as always, thank you for listening. Your support makes telling these epic stories possible.